Eli Navarro had 40 days before the county auctioned off the 12 blackened acres his grandfather had planted with his own hands, the same acres the Cinder Ridge fire had turned into a field of ash 8 months earlier. 40 yards from where he stood that morning, a woman he had never met was parked at the edge of the burn scar, staring through a pair of binoculars at something green that, according to everyone in town, should not have been there at all. The smell hit Eli before anything else did. Every single morning. Not smoke anymore, that had faded months ago, but the dry mineral scent of scorched earth, something between a snuffed-out candle and old rust, that clung to the air around the property, no matter which way the wind blew. He'd stopped noticing the smell of ash the way you stopped noticing your own house. What he still noticed, every time, was the sound his boots made crossing what used to be his grandfather's orchard. A brittle, hollow crunch, like walking on a floor made of eggshells. 14 acres of almond and walnut trees, planted by Thomas Navarro back when Eli's mother was still in grade school, reduced in one October afternoon to a graveyard of black trunks standing at odd angles, like something had reached down from the sky and simply snapped the life out of them. Eli was 15, and he had already lost more than most people his age. His father, Manuel, had died 3 years earlier in an accident at a logging site 2 counties over, leaving behind a stack of medical bills that never quite disappeared, no matter how many hours his mother, Carla, picked up at the county hospital where she worked as a nurse's aide. The orchard had been the one thing that still felt like it belonged to somebody. His grandfather's legacy, then his father's dream of restoring it, and now just Eli's problem to carry, since he was the only one with time to walk the burned rows, and the only one who still believed there was a reason to. In the tool shed behind the house, hanging on a bent nail his grandfather had driven into the wall decades ago, was a pair of stiff leather work gloves, cracked at the knuckles, and next to them, a wooden seed box with Thomas Navarro's initials burned into the lid. Nobody had touched either one since the funeral. Eli walked past them almost every day without opening the shed door all the way you avoid looking directly at something that still hurts. He remembered faintly now, riding on his father's shoulders through those same rows when he was 5 or 6, reaching up to touch the low white blossoms in spring, while his grandfather walked ahead with a pruning saw slung over one shoulder, calling back instructions neither Eli nor his father ever quite followed correctly. That memory had a soft, worn edge to it now, the way old photographs do, and Eli found himself reaching for it more often since the fire than he ever had before. Not because it made the loss easier, but because it was proof that the land had once meant something other than debt and blackened wood. His mother kept a framed photo on the kitchen windowsill. Thomas Navarro standing in the middle of the orchard in full bloom, sleeves rolled up, one hand resting on a trunk that no longer existed. Eli caught her looking at it some mornings, while she made coffee before her shift, not saying anything, just looking. And he'd learned not to interrupt those moments, because there wasn't anything either of them could say that would make the photograph and the view out the kitchen window match again. That morning, he pulled the door shut behind him, laced his boots, and walked out toward the county road, telling himself the same thing he'd told himself for the last several weeks, that normal was already gone, and whatever came next was going to test exactly how much he had left to give. 2 hours later, sitting in third period biology, Eli barely heard Mr. Okafor announce the semester's environmental restoration project. Pick a local ecosystem, propose an intervention, document the results. Half the class groaned. Eli wrote 3 words in the margin of his notebook: the burn site. He told himself it was just an assignment, an easy A, since he already knew the land better than any textbook plot the other students would choose. He didn't tell himself the truth yet, that some part of him had been waiting for an excuse to go back out there with a purpose instead of just grief. By lunch, word had already spread. "Navarro's doing his project on his dead field," said Carson Hale, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Bro, that soil's cooked. My dad says nothing grows back there for like 20 years. A few kids laughed. Eli didn't answer. He'd learned over the last 3 years that silence cost less than arguing with people who'd already made up their minds. What none of them knew, what Eli himself didn't know yet, was that 40 minutes away, at a state agricultural extension office, A retired soil scientist named Diane Castellano had just pulled up satellite burn severity maps of 6 counties, looking for something specific, a patch of unburned mycelium deep enough to have survived, in soil everyone else had already written off as dead. The bus dropped Eli off at the end of Coldwater Road, same as always, and he walked the last half-mile past Hollis Bragg's cattle fence, past the blackened fence posts nobody had replaced, until the burn scar opened up in front of him, a wide, dark bowl in the land, ringed by hills that were slowly turning green again, while the orchard itself stayed the color of a dead fireplace. He climbed the low ridge at the property's edge and stood there the way he did most afternoons now, looking down at 12 acres of nothing, trying to see past what the land looked like now to what it had looked like in his father's old photographs. Rows of almond trees in white bloom, his grandfather standing in the middle of them with his sleeves rolled up. His phone buzzed. A message from his cousin Marisol. "Everyone's saying you're doing some tree project on the burn field. LOL, is that true?" He typed back a single word, "Yeah," and put the phone away before she could respond. That evening at the kitchen table, his mother set down 2 plates of rice and beans and asked him carefully the question he knew was coming. "County sent another letter," she said. "Back taxes on the orchard parcel are due in 6 weeks. If we can't pay them, or show we're actually using the land for something, they roll it into the tax auction. Developers already offered $11,000 for the whole 12 acres. That's less than what Dad paid for 1 used truck." Eli didn't say anything for a long moment. $11,000 was real money, the kind that could clear half the medical debt sitting in a folder in the kitchen drawer. It was also, he knew, a fraction of what the land had been worth before the fire, and it meant giving up the last piece of anything his grandfather had built. "I want to try something with it first," he said finally, "for a school project. Just give me some time before you decide anything." His mother studied him for a while, the way she did when she was deciding whether to spend energy she didn't have arguing. "6 weeks, Eli," she said. "That's what we've got." He lay awake that night doing the math in his head, over and over, the way teenagers do when a number feels both impossibly large and impossibly small at the same time. 40 days, 12 acres, soil that everyone, including the county assessor's report stapled to the letter on the kitchen table, had labeled unproductive. He didn't have a plan yet. He just had a stubborn, uncomfortable feeling that the land wasn't as dead as everyone kept telling him it was, and no real way yet to prove it. At school the next day, he found himself staring at the assessor's report again during study hall, at a single line near the bottom that classified the parcel as non-productive agricultural severity class 3 burn. He didn't know what most of those words meant yet, not technically, but he understood the shape of the sentence well enough. It was a way of saying the land, like a person, could be written off entirely by someone who'd only ever looked at it from a car window. He thought about his grandfather, walking those same rows for 40 years, about how little of that history could ever fit into a line on a government form. And something in him hardened into a decision before he'd even worked out the details of a plan. He started small, an old 3-ring binder from his closet, relabeled in marker across the spine, filled with printed satellite images of the burn scar, a hand-drawn map of the original orchard rows copied from a photo his mother had, and a single page of notes titled, "Without much confidence, Things I Actually Know About This Land." It wasn't much, but it was the first time since the fire that Eli had done something with the property besides walk it and grieve it, and that distinction, small as it was, mattered more to him than he expected. The first person to actually laugh in his face was Hollis Bragg, 3 days later, when Eli asked permission to run an extension cord across the property line to power a soil moisture meter he'd checked out from the school science lab. "Kid," Bragg said, leaning on his truck door, "that ground's been burned clean through. You could pour gold dust on it, and nothing's coming up for a generation. Save yourself the walk." Eli thanked him anyway, ran the cord the long way around instead, and spent the whole afternoon pushing the meter's probe into soil, so compacted and dry it barely registered a reading at all. The data, when he finally got it, was worse than he'd expected. Almost no organic matter left in the top 6 inches. pH pushed high by the ash. No visible fungal structure in any of the samples he scraped into sandwich bags to look at under Mr. Okafor's classroom microscope. When he presented his preliminary findings, one student, Carson again, asked, only half joking, if his big restoration plan was just going to be standing in a burned field and hoping. A few kids laughed harder than the joke deserved. Mr. Okafor didn't laugh, but he didn't stop them either. Just told the class to settle down and asked Eli, not unkindly, whether he had a specific intervention in mind or just a location. A second, quieter obstacle came from somewhere Eli hadn't expected. His mother's older sister, Aunt Rosa, who called from 2 towns over after hearing about the tax letter through the family grapevine. She meant well, in the blunt way relatives sometimes do, telling Carla over speakerphone that the smartest thing the family could do was take the developer's offer, pay down the medical debt, and stop romanticizing a field that isn't coming back. She wasn't wrong about the debt, and Eli knew it, sitting at the table pretending to do homework while he listened. It was one thing to be mocked by classmates who didn't know his grandfather's name. It was another thing entirely to hear the same doubt from someone who'd known Thomas Navarro personally, who'd eaten dinner under those trees as a kid herself. He didn't, not yet. That was the truthful, humiliating part. What he did have 2 days later was a stranger's truck parked at the edge of his family's land when he got off the bus. A woman in her 60s, gray hair pulled back, kneeling in the dirt near the old fence line with a hand trowel and a small sample kit, was digging carefully around a cluster of pale green shoots, pushing up through a patch of soil that looked to Eli exactly like every other patch of burned soil on the property. He almost turned around. Instead, he asked her, as evenly as he could manage, what she was doing on his family's land. She stood, brushed the dirt off her knees, and introduced herself as Diane Castellano, formerly with the State Agricultural Extension, now doing independent research on post-fire soil recovery. I saw something on the satellite imagery that shouldn't be here, she said, gesturing at the chutes. There's a chance, not a guarantee, a chance, that some of the underground fungal networks survived the fire deeper than people assume. If it did, that changes what's possible here. Eli didn't fully understand what she meant, but he understood enough to feel something shift in his chest for the first time in months. The sense that someone else, someone who actually knew what they were talking about, thought the land might not be as finished as everyone kept insisting. She didn't tell him everything that day, only that she wanted to come back and take proper samples, and that if he was serious about a restoration project, he should be careful who he trusted with his time, because most of the advice he'd get around here would be well-meaning and wrong. What she didn't say, not yet, was why a retired scientist with no obvious reason to drive 4 hours round trip kept coming back to a 12-acre burn scar owned by a family she'd never met. By the following week, Eli had a name for what Diane was talking about. Mycorrhizal networks, the underground webs of fungal threads that connect tree roots to nutrients and water, and, in healthy soil, to each other. And a plan that sounded, even to him, faintly ridiculous when he said it out loud. Instead of trying to force new trees into dead soil, spend months rebuilding the soil itself, using compost, biochar, and inoculated starter cultures of the same fungi that might still be alive underground, waiting. He also had a second problem, one that had nothing to do with fungi. Hollis Bragg, annoyed by kids poking around near his fence line, filed a complaint with the county about unauthorized soil testing and equipment left on unmaintained land, which brought a code enforcement officer out to the property with a clipboard and a list of ordinances Eli had never heard of. His mother had to leave work early to meet the officer, losing half a day's pay to stand in a burned field, explaining that her son was doing a school project, not running an illegal operation. The officer wasn't unkind, but he was clear. Any structures, containers, or ongoing work on the parcel needed to be documented and eventually approved, or the county could treat it as a violation on top of the existing tax issue. It was one more deadline stacked on top of the one already sitting on the kitchen table. The code enforcement visit left its own small scar. Carla had to explain, twice, in front of a stranger with a clipboard, why her 15-year-old son was digging holes in a field the county considered a liability. And Eli watched something tired pass across her face that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with being asked again, to defend a decision she hadn't fully agreed to herself. She didn't tell him to stop. She also didn't tell him she believed it would work. And the space between those two things sat uncomfortably at the kitchen table for the rest of that week. That night, for the first time, Eli let himself wonder if Carson and Bragg and Aunt Rosa and everyone else had simply been right from the start. That some things, once burned badly enough, just don't come back. And the only mistake here was his own refusal to accept that. But what he didn't know yet was that Diane Castellano had already started making calls of her own, quietly, to people who could help him do this properly, instead of alone. And what happened over the next several weeks was going to prove nearly everyone in Cedar Hollow wrong, in ways none of them, including Eli, could have predicted yet. Diane came back on a Saturday with a folding table, 3 sample jars, and a printout of lab results from soil cores she'd taken the week before without telling him, because she hadn't wanted to get his hopes up over nothing. She spread the printout on the table and pointed to a section near the bottom, dense with numbers Eli didn't understand yet. "There's viable mycorrhizal fungi in the deeper soil layer," she said, "along the old root channels where your grandfather's trees used to stand. Not everywhere, but enough in patches that if we feed it correctly, it can start rebuilding the network from underground, instead of us trying to plant new trees on top of dead dirt and hoping." It wasn't the miracle Eli had half hoped for. It was smaller and stranger than that. A partial answer, a foothold instead of a finish line. Diane pulled a second page from her folder, a rough diagram of the old orchard rows, overlaid with faint markings, where her soil cores had picked up signs of surviving fungal threads, mostly clustered near where the oldest, deepest-rooted trees had once stood. "It's not the whole 12 acres, she told him. "Maybe 3, 4 acres where the network has a real chance. The rest would need to be rebuilt from those pockets outward, slowly, the way a fire itself spreads, except backward." She was careful to say the rest directly. This could take years, not months, and there was no guarantee the network would recover fully, or that new trees planted on top of it would survive even if it did. What she didn't tell him that day, she'd mention it weeks later, almost in passing, over the folding table while labeling sample jars, was that 15 years earlier, a fire had taken her own family's land in a different county, and that the recovery, when it finally came, had taken longer than anyone she loved had the patience to wait for. She'd watched her father sell before it finished healing. She wasn't going to say so outright, not yet, but some part of why she kept driving 4 hours round trip had very little to do with research grants. The complication, when it came, was practical and unglamorous. This method required a season of preparation before a single tree could safely go into the ground. Biochar worked into the topsoil to hold nutrients and moisture. Compost teas brewed to reintroduce microbial life. Mycorrhizal starter cultures applied directly along the surviving root channels, and months of monitoring before any of it could be trusted to support new growth. It meant no dramatic before and after for Eli's class presentation, no fast win to shut Carson up. It meant showing up after school, week after week, mixing compost by hand in his grandfather's wooden seed box because it was the right size, and because some days, having it there felt like enough of a reason to keep going. His first attempt at applying the mycorrhizal inoculant in early spring failed outright. The batch had been left too long in the truck bed under direct sun before Eli got to it, killing most of the living culture before it ever touched soil. Diane found out gently, checking his application logs against her own notes, and didn't scold him, which somehow made him feel worse than if she had. 6 weeks of preparation, undone by one afternoon of carelessness. He sat on the ridge that evening longer than usual, staring down at rows he'd marked with stakes and string, wondering whether he had it in him to start the whole process over with the clock on the tax deadline running out faster than his second attempt could possibly catch up. He almost didn't. For 3 days, he skipped the property altogether, telling his mother he had homework, telling himself he was just tired. What pulled him back, in the end, wasn't a speech from Diane or a change of heart from Carson. It was finding his grandfather's seed box still sitting where he'd left it on the folding table, half filled with compost that had, against expectations, stayed damp and alive under a tarp through 3 days of neglect. Something about that, the fact that the smallest, most stubborn part of the process had kept going without him, made him pick the trowel back up. The second application, in April, he did differently. Culture kept refrigerated until the last possible moment, applied at dusk instead of midday heat, along a wider stretch of the surviving route channels Diane had mapped out with him, on hands and knees, over 2 full weekends. It wasn't glamorous work. Most days it looked, to anyone driving past on Coldwater Road, exactly like a teenager, kneeling in a burned field, doing nothing useful at all. Carson's jokes at school had mostly faded into indifference by then, which somehow stung in a smaller, quieter way than the mockery had. As if even the ridicule had decided the project wasn't worth the energy. Beyond the fungal work, Diane pushed Eli to learn a second, more patient skill that spring, reading the land itself instead of just testing it. She taught him to recognize, without instruments, which patches of soil held moisture longer after rain, which sections had started to crust over, and which stayed loose and workable, which weeds first appeared in the recovering areas, and what their presence actually meant about what was happening underground. It was slower than any lab result, and less satisfying in the moment, but it changed how Eli walked the property, no longer just checking on a project, but actually seeing it, the way his grandfather must have seen it once, without needing a printout to tell him something had changed. He kept a small notebook of his own that spring, separate from the shared spreadsheet Diane used for her research, filled with rougher, more personal observations. A page noting the first morning frost lifted early enough to matter. A page describing the particular gray-green color of a fungal bloom he found under a rotting log near the fence line. A page, near the middle, where he'd written and then half-crossed out a single line. Wonder what Dad would think of all this. He didn't show that notebook to anyone, not even Diane, but he carried it in his backpack most days that spring, the way some people carry a photograph. By late May, 6 weeks after the second application, and 1 week before the extended tax deadline, his mother had managed to negotiate with the county, citing the ongoing restoration project as evidence of active land use. The first real sign appeared. A scattering of native grass and clover, thin but unmistakably green, spreading across sections of soil that had tested lifeless in February. It wasn't trees. It wasn't proof of anything permanent. But it was more green, in more places, than the land had shown since the fire. And Eli stood at the edge of it for a long time before he let himself believe it wasn't a fluke. Just as the extension request came through, buying the family 6 more months before any tax auction could proceed, a different kind of complication arrived. An early summer thunderstorm dumped nearly 2 inches of rain in one night, more than the still fragile soil structure could absorb. And Eli woke to find several of the marked test plots washed into shallow gullies, the careful layering of biochar and compost scattered and thin in places where it mattered most. He biked out to the property before school, still half asleep, and stood at the edge of the largest gully in his school clothes, watching brown water pool where clover had just started to spread the week before. Standing in the mud that morning, looking at 3 months of work half undone by a single storm, Eli felt something close to despair, for the first time since he'd started, not because the science had failed, but because it seemed like no matter how carefully he did everything right, the land, or the world, or both, could still take it away from him overnight. He thought, standing there, about the $11,000 offer still technically on the table, about how much simpler it would be to just let his mother take it, pay down what they owed, and stop measuring his own worth against soil that seemed determined to keep proving everyone else right. He didn't call Diane that morning. He didn't go to school on time either, which was unlike him. He just stood there for a while, letting the water soak through his shoes, before he finally turned around and walked home. It was the closest he came to quitting for good, and it would take one more conversation, one more choice, before he found a reason to keep going. Diane found him sitting in the mud that morning, not saying much, and instead of offering comfort, she started working, repacking the washed soil by hand, showing him how to build small contour berms along the slope to slow future runoff, treating the damage as a problem with a solution rather than an ending. It's setback, she said eventually, not failure. Real restoration doesn't move in a straight line. If you want a straight line, this was never going to be the project for you. Eli didn't answer, but he picked up a shovel. Over that summer, the work shifted from something Eli did alone into something closer to a small, unlikely team. Marisol started showing up on weekends, mostly to keep him company, but eventually to help haul compost and log soil temperature readings into a shared spreadsheet Diane had set up. Mr. Okafor, impressed by the actual data Eli was now bringing to class instead of vague hopes, connected him with a state wildfire recovery grant meant for youth-led environmental projects. Small money, a few $100s for supplies, but enough to buy proper equipment instead of borrowed school gear. Even Hollis Bragg, after watching the clover spread visibly along the fence line that summer, stopped filing complaints, though he never quite admitted out loud that he'd been wrong. By early fall, the first young trees went into the ground. Not almonds yet, Diane had advised against rushing back to the original crop. But hardier native oaks and pines meant to stabilize the rebuilding soil and eventually host the almond trees again, once the network beneath them was strong enough to support fruit-bearing growth. Eli planted the first sapling in the exact spot where his grandfather's favorite tree had once stood, using his grandfather's old seed box to carry the seedling to the hole, wearing, for the first time since the funeral, the cracked leather gloves that had hung untouched on the shed wall for 3 years. They still didn't quite fit right. He wore them anyway. The tax situation resolved itself, quietly and without fanfare. 6 weeks later, the county, reviewing the documented restoration progress, alongside a partial payment plan, Carla had finally been able to arrange, once she picked up a small stipend tied to the youth grant program, agreed to hold off on any auction as long as active restoration continued. It wasn't a dramatic rescue, it was paperwork and patience, the kind of ending real life actually offers instead of the kind movies do. But it meant the land stayed in the family, and that, more than any grant or article, was the thing Eli had actually been fighting for the whole time, even when he hadn't fully admitted that to himself. What none of them, not Eli, not Diane, not even Carla, could have predicted that fall was how far the story would eventually travel, or how long it would take for the 12 acres to stop being the joke of Cedar Hollow and start being something else entirely. 5 years passed the way most real change does, not in a single dramatic season, but in a long accumulation of ordinary days that only look remarkable when you finally stop and measure the distance between where something started and where it ended up. Eli was 20 now, home for the summer between his second and third year, studying environmental science at a state university 2 hours away, a decision that had felt inevitable by the time he applied, though it hadn't felt inevitable at all back when he was 15 and kneeling in ash with a soil moisture meter that barely registered a reading. The 12 acres no longer looked anything like the burn scar Diane Castellano had once stood at the edge of with a pair of binoculars. Young oaks and pines, now taller than Eli himself, formed a loose canopy over sections of understory, where native grasses and wildflowers had returned on their own, seeded by wind and birds, once the soil could support them again. In the original orchard rows, the first replanted almond saplings, planted 3 years earlier, once Diane's soil tests finally showed a mycorrhizal network dense and stable enough to support them, had grown tall enough to produce their first small, tentative harvest that spring, a detail that made Carla cry the first time she saw the blossoms, though she never fully explained why to anyone but Eli. The county held a small dedication ceremony that August, renaming the site the Navarro Grove Demonstration Forest, and installing a modest interpretive sign at the entrance describing the soil recovery methods used there, the same methods now being taught, in simplified form, to 3 other post-fire communities in the region who'd reached out after hearing what a teenager and a retired scientist had managed to do with 12 acres everyone else had written off. Diane stood beside Eli at the ceremony, older now, her research on post-fire mycorrhizal recovery finally published and cited by restoration projects well outside the county, though she'd say, if anyone asked, that the 12 acres in Cedar Hollow still mattered to her more than any of the papers with her name on them. Carson Hale, of all people, showed up to the ceremony too, older and visibly a little embarrassed, and told Eli afterward, almost too quietly for anyone else to hear, that he was sorry for the jokes back in 9th grade, that he hadn't understood back then what patience like that actually looked like from the outside. Eli told him it was fine, and mostly meant it. Hollis Bragg came as well, unprompted, and stood at the fence line the whole ceremony without saying much of anything. Though the following spring he'd quietly ask Eli for advice about restoring a scorched section of his own pasture, which was, in its own gruff way, as close to an apology as the man was ever going to give. Even Aunt Rosa was there, standing near Carla with a hand resting lightly on her sister's shoulder. And when the county official finished reading the plaque aloud, a short paragraph crediting a youth-led restoration effort grounded in patience, science, and community, Eli caught her wiping her eyes quickly, the way people do when they don't want to be seen doing it. Nobody brought up the phone call from 5 years earlier. Nobody needed to. His mother spoke briefly too, unplanned, when the county representative asked if the family wanted to say anything. She talked for less than a minute, mostly about her father-in-law and the trees he'd planted before she'd even met her husband. And then, almost as an afterthought, about how she'd almost sold the land twice, once out of grief, once out of exhaustion, and how grateful she was now that her son hadn't let her. Eli hadn't known about the second time. He didn't ask her about it that day. There would be time for that conversation later, the way there was time now for most things that mattered. Before the ceremony ended, Eli walked alone to the spot near the fence line, where the first oak sapling had gone into the ground 5 years earlier, now grown into a young tree with real shade beneath it. He was still wearing his grandfather's gloves, patched twice now, the leather softened from years of actual use instead of hanging idle on a nail. And he set the old wooden seed box, worn smooth at the corners, down at the base of the tree, the same box that had carried compost through 2 failed attempts and 1 storm that had nearly ended everything, before it ever carried a single living seed into the ground. He didn't say anything out loud. He didn't need to. The land around him, green and slow and stubbornly alive, said everything that needed saying, that some things worth doing don't announce themselves with a single dramatic moment, but arrive quietly, one season at a time, for anyone patient enough to stay and watch them grow.